He believed he could erase her presence with a single command, but in less than a minute, that decision would unravel everything he thought he controlled. The boutique glowed under warm golden lights, its polished marble floors reflecting rows of designer gowns priced higher than most people's monthly rent, and every inch of the space whispered exclusivity, a place where only the elite belonged, or at least that's what Richard Vaughan made sure everyone believed. At 48, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than a used car, he stood near the center like a gatekeeper of status, his sharp eyes scanning every customer not with curiosity, but with judgment. That was when Naomi Carter stepped inside, her soft footsteps barely making a sound against the marble, her presence quiet but steady, a simple beige cardigan draped over her shoulders, a worn canvas bag hanging lightly from her hand, the kind of bag that didn't belong in a place like this, at least not to the people watching. Conversation softened, not because she demanded attention, but because she disrupted the illusion, a ripple in a carefully controlled world. A sales associate glanced at her, hesitated, then looked away, unsure whether to approach or ignore. Naomi didn't seem to notice, or maybe she chose not to. Her eyes moved calmly across the room, studying fabrics, stitching, silhouettes, the way someone does when they understand more than they reveal. From across the floor, Richard noticed her within seconds, his expression tightening ever so slightly, not anger, not yet, but something colder, calculation. He had built his reputation on precision, on knowing exactly who belonged and who didn't, and to him, Naomi didn't fit the equation. He adjusted his cufflinks slowly, taking a measured step forward, each movement deliberate, controlled, as if the space itself responded to him. Nearby customers shifted subtly, sensing something about to unfold, though no one said a word. Naomi paused near a display of hand-stitched evening gowns, her fingers hovering just inches from the fabric, not touching, just observing, appreciating. That was enough. In Richard's world, even the way you looked at something signaled whether you deserved it. He approached, his polished shoes echoing faintly, stopping just close enough to assert presence without raising his voice. "Ma'am," he said, his tone smooth but edged with quiet dismissal, "this section is reserved." Naomi turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze with calm, unshaken eyes, not defensive, not apologetic, just steady. For a brief second, something unfamiliar flickered across Richard's face, something he couldn't quite place, and that unsettled him more than he would ever admit. Around them, the air tightened, conversations faded into silence, and though no one had been told to watch, everyone was watching. Because moments like this, moments where someone is quietly measured and publicly judged, always carried a strange gravity. And Richard, convinced he was about to restore order, had no idea he had just stepped into something far beyond his control. Richard Vaughan held her gaze for a moment longer than he intended, as if expecting her to lower her eyes, to apologize, to step back into the role he had already assigned to her, but Naomi Carter did not move, and that stillness, that quiet refusal to shrink, created a tension that spread through the boutique like a slow ripple across glass. He exhaled softly through his nose, a subtle sign of irritation masked beneath practiced composure, then allowed a thin smile to form, the kind that never reached his eyes. "This area is reserved for clients with scheduled appointments," he repeated, slightly louder this time, just enough for nearby customers to hear, just enough to make the distinction clear. A few heads turned more openly now, drawn in by the shift in tone, by the unspoken understanding that something was being decided in real time. Naomi glanced briefly at the gown in front of her, her eyes tracing the seam along the bodice, the stitching precise but not flawless, then she looked back at him, her expression unchanged, calm, almost thoughtful, as if she were observing more than just the fabric. "I was only looking," she said quietly, her voice steady, carrying no trace of defensiveness, which somehow made it stand out even more. In the growing silence, Richard's smile tightened. In his world, compliance was immediate, unquestioned, and anything else felt like resistance, even if it came wrapped in politeness. He shifted his weight slightly, angling his body in a way that subtly blocked her from the display, a silent assertion of control that did not require raised voices or overt gestures. "Looking can be disruptive in a space like this," he replied, his tone smooth but edged with condescension, as though explaining a rule to someone who should have known better. A woman standing a few feet away adjusted her designer handbag, watching closely now, her curiosity no longer hidden. Another customer paused mid-conversation, her eyes flicking between Naomi and Richard, sensing that the moment had crossed from ordinary interaction into something else entirely. Naomi's fingers curled slightly around the strap of her canvas bag, not tightly, not nervously, just enough to anchor herself, and for a brief second, her gaze moved past Richard, taking in the room, the polished floors, the attentive staff, the carefully curated atmosphere that depended so heavily on perception. When her eyes returned to him, there was something deeper there, something unreadable, but it passed so quickly it could have been imagined. "I understand," she said, and for a heartbeat, it sounded like agreement, like surrender, exactly what Richard expected, exactly what he had trained himself to anticipate in moments like this. But she did not step away. She remained exactly where she was, her posture relaxed, her presence unchanged, and that contradiction unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain. Around them, the silence thickened, conversations fully paused now, the entire room held in a quiet suspension, waiting without realizing they were waiting. Richard felt it, the shift in attention, the weight of being observed, and that only sharpened his resolve. He could not allow ambiguity here, not in his space, not in front of his clientele. He straightened slightly, his voice firming with quiet authority. "I am going to have to ask you to leave," he said, each word measured, deliberate, designed to close the moment cleanly. And yet, even as he spoke, something about Naomi's stillness, her calm, her refusal to react the way he expected, lingered in the air, like a note that had not quite resolved, and it made the room feel smaller, tighter, as if everyone present sensed that the situation was not unfolding the way it usually did. For a brief second, it seemed like the entire boutique held its breath, as if the air itself was waiting to see whether Naomi Carter would obey or resist, and in that silence, Richard Vaughn expected the familiar outcome, the quiet retreat, the lowered gaze, the apology that restored his version of order, but instead, Naomi simply stood there, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, and that absence of reaction created something far more uncomfortable than defiance. The polished marble floors reflected the stillness, the golden lights casting soft shadows that made every movement, or lack of movement, feel amplified. Naomi's eyes drifted once more to the gown beside her, her gaze lingering on a subtle flaw in the stitching along the hem, a detail so small that no one else in the room had noticed, or perhaps no one else knew how to see. Her fingers lifted slightly, hovering near the fabric again, but she did not touch it, as if respecting something deeper than the rules being imposed on her. Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He was not used to being ignored, not in his own space, not in front of an audience that had already begun to form without invitation. A man near the fitting area adjusted his glasses, pretending to browse while clearly listening, while a young sales associate stood frozen near the counter, unsure whether to intervene or remain invisible. Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm, almost reflective. "This piece," she said softly, her eyes still on the gown, "the seam here will not hold after a few wears." The words landed gently, but they carried a weight that did not belong in a moment like this. A faint murmur rippled through the nearby customers, subtle but undeniable. Richard blinked once, caught off guard not by the statement itself, but by the confidence behind it. He followed her gaze to the gown, as if seeing it for the first time, but quickly dismissed the thought, his expression hardening again. "I assure you," he replied, his tone sharper now, "our pieces are crafted to the highest standards." Naomi turned her head slowly, meeting his eyes again, and there was no challenge in her expression, no arrogance, just a quiet certainty that felt strangely immovable. "Standards depend on who is setting them," she said, her voice even, almost gentle, and for a moment, no one in the room knew how to respond. The silence deepened, stretching longer than it should have, and Richard felt it pressing against him, the attention, the uncertainty, the subtle shift in control that he could not quite name. He cleared his throat, straightening his posture, reclaiming the authority he believed was his by right. "That will be all," he said firmly, raising his hand slightly, not toward Naomi, but toward the security desk near the entrance. The gesture was small, almost casual, but its meaning was unmistakable. Across the room, a tall man in a dark suit began to move, his steps measured, professional, his expression neutral as he approached. Naomi did not look at him. She did not step back. She did not speak again. And as the sound of his footsteps echoed softly across the marble, the room fell into a deeper silence, one that felt less like anticipation and more like the moment before something irreversible begins. The security guard's footsteps echoed softly against the marble, each step measured, controlled, and yet somehow heavier than expected, as if the entire room could feel the weight of what was about to happen, and still, Naomi Carter did not move, her gaze resting calmly on the gown as though the moment unfolding around her did not demand her attention. The guard, a tall man with a composed demeanor and years of experience written in the subtle confidence of his posture, approached with quiet professionalism, but as he drew closer, something in his expression shifted, not alarm, not confusion, but recognition, faint and fleeting, like a memory surfacing just beneath the surface. Richard Vaughn noticed it, even if he could not immediately name it, and that alone unsettled him more than Naomi's stillness ever could. "Escort her out," Richard said, his voice low but firm, each word carrying the expectation of immediate compliance, the kind of command that had rarely been questioned in this space. The guard stopped just short of Naomi, his eyes briefly meeting hers, and in that single glance, something passed between them that no one else in the room could fully understand, not a signal, not an exchange of words, but an awareness, quiet and undeniable. Naomi gave the slightest nod, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as if she had been expecting this moment all along. The room had gone completely silent now, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears, making even the smallest sound feel amplified. A customer near the entrance shifted uncomfortably, her heels clicking faintly as she adjusted her stance, while another held her breath without realizing it, her attention fixed entirely on the unfolding scene. The guard turned slightly toward Richard, his posture still respectful, but no longer automatic, no longer purely reactive. For a fraction of a second, he hesitated, and that hesitation, small as it was, cracked something in the carefully maintained rhythm of the room. Richard's expression hardened. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone carrying a sharp edge now, the first sign that control was beginning to slip, even if only slightly. The guard did not answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, leaning in just enough to ensure that his next words would not carry beyond their intended audience. From where they stood, no one else could hear, but everyone could see. Naomi remained still, her hands resting lightly against the strap of her bag, her breathing even, her presence unchanged, as though the outcome of this moment was already known to her in a way that defied explanation. The guard's lips moved, his voice low, almost a whisper, and whatever he said, it landed with a force far greater than its volume. Richard's reaction was immediate, though subtle at first, a flicker in his eyes, a tightening in his jaw, the kind of response that could easily be missed if one was not watching closely, but in a room where every detail had become magnified, nothing went unnoticed. His posture shifted, just slightly, the confidence that had once anchored him beginning to fracture at the edges. The silence deepened, no longer just anticipation, but something heavier, something irreversible. And for the first time since Naomi had walked through those doors, Richard Vaughn was no longer certain of the role he was playing. Whatever the guard whispered did not echo across the marble floors, but its impact spread faster than any sound could have, settling into the room like a sudden drop in temperature, and Richard Vaughn felt it before he could process it, a subtle but undeniable shift that began behind his eyes and moved through his posture, loosening the certainty he had worn so comfortably just moments before. His lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but no words came out, and that alone was enough to fracture the illusion he had built around himself. The customers noticed first, not the words, but the reaction, the way his shoulders no longer held the same authority, the way his gaze flickered, searching for something that was no longer there. The guard stepped back, returning to a neutral stance, but his eyes remained steady, no longer awaiting instruction, no longer part of the hierarchy that had defined the room. Naomi Carter did not move. She stood exactly where she had been, her presence unchanged, her calm now carrying a different weight, not quiet resistance, but quiet certainty. Richard swallowed, a small, involuntary motion that seemed louder than it should have in the heavy silence. "That is not possible," he said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier edge, as though he were speaking more to himself than to anyone else. No one responded. No one needed to. The statement itself felt misplaced, disconnected from the moment, and yet it revealed more than any explanation could have. Naomi's gaze shifted to him, not with triumph, not with judgment, but with a kind of measured patience, as if she had seen this moment play out before, perhaps many times, in many different forms. Around them, the boutique no longer felt like a controlled environment, but something fragile, something that could no longer sustain the narrative it had been built upon. A woman near the display slowly lowered her phone, realizing she had been holding it up without remembering when she had started. Another customer adjusted her posture, her earlier confidence replaced with uncertainty, as though she were suddenly aware that she had misread the entire situation. Richard straightened slightly, attempting to reclaim composure, but the effort felt forced, like a performance that had already lost its audience. "If there has been some misunderstanding," he began, his tone shifting towards something more careful, more deliberate, "we can address it privately." The words hung in the air, an attempt to contain what had already escaped, to pull the moment back into a space where he could control it, but the room did not respond the way it once would have. Naomi's lips curved ever so slightly, not quite a smile, not quite anything that could be easily defined. "You already addressed it," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him, and in that sentence, simple as it was, there was a finality that settled deeper than any raised voice ever could. The guard remained still, the staff unmoving, the customers silent, and in that shared stillness, the roles in the room had shifted completely, not through force, not through argument, but through something far more unsettling, the quiet exposure of truth. And as Richard stood there, no longer certain of where he stood or who he was in that moment, it became clear that whatever had been whispered to him was not just information, it was a revelation he could not ignore, and one he could not undo. The silence did not break, it deepened, settling over the boutique like something permanent, something that could not simply be dismissed or redirected, and Richard Vaughan felt it pressing in from all sides, not as noise, but as absence, the absence of control he had always relied on. His eyes moved briefly toward the security guard, searching for confirmation, for denial, for anything that could restore the structure of the moment, but the guard remained still, his expression neutral, his role no longer reactive but quietly definitive. Naomi Carter shifted her gaze once more toward the gown, as if returning to something unfinished, her attention calm, unhurried, completely untouched by the tension that had overtaken the room. She lifted her hand this time, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric, not with entitlement, not with hesitation, but with familiarity, the kind that comes from understanding every thread, every seam, every intention behind the design. A faint ripple of movement passed through the nearby customers, not stepping away, but adjusting, as if they were now witnessing something they had not expected to see, something they did not yet fully understand. Richard noticed it, the shift in how people were looking, not at him, but at her, and that subtle redirection of attention unsettled him more than the whisper itself. He cleared his throat again, the sound sharper this time, an attempt to reclaim presence, to remind the room, and perhaps himself, of his position. "If you would just step aside for a moment," he said, his voice measured, though no longer carrying the same authority, "we can resolve this without unnecessary attention." But the words felt hollow the moment they left his mouth, as if they belonged to a version of the situation that no longer existed. Naomi did not step aside. Instead, she turned slightly, her body angling just enough to face him more directly, her expression composed, her eyes steady, and there was something in that stillness that made the entire room feel as though it had shifted its center. "Attention was never the problem," she said quietly, her voice even, almost reflective, and though she did not raise it, every person in the boutique seemed to hear it clearly. The statement lingered, not as a challenge, but as a truth that did not require defense. Richard's fingers flexed at his side, a small movement, but one that revealed more than he intended, the tension he was trying to contain, the uncertainty he could no longer fully hide. He glanced again at the gown, then back at Naomi, as if trying to reconcile two conflicting realities, the one he believed in and the one unfolding in front of him. "You made a claim," he said, choosing his words carefully now, "about the craftsmanship. On what basis?" It was an attempt to shift the conversation, to regain footing through logic, through detail, through something measurable. Naomi's gaze softened slightly, not with sympathy, but with clarity. "Because I have made pieces like this," she replied, her tone calm, certain, and for the first time, there was no ambiguity in what she meant. A faint murmur moved through the room again, louder this time, not in volume, but in awareness. The sales associate near the counter blinked, her eyes moving between Naomi and the gown, as if seeing both differently now. Richard's expression tightened, but not with dismissal, not anymore. "Made," he repeated, the word landing differently now, heavier, more deliberate. Naomi gave a small nod, her hand resting lightly against the fabric, her touch precise, intentional. "For houses that do not need to announce themselves," she said, and in that moment, the balance of the room shifted completely, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be reversed, because what had been revealed was not just who she was, but how little the room had understood before. The words did not need to be repeated to be understood, they settled into the room with a quiet weight that shifted every perspective at once, and for the first time, the boutique no longer felt like a place defined by price tags or polished displays, but by something far more fragile, perception. Richard Vaughan stood still, his mind moving quickly behind an expression that was no longer as controlled as before, trying to reconcile what he had just heard with everything he believed about the space he commanded. The phrase echoed in his thoughts, not because it was loud, but because it was precise, houses that do not need to announce themselves, and suddenly, the confidence he had worn like armor began to feel thinner, less certain. Around them, the customers who had once observed Naomi with quiet judgment now watched her with something entirely different, curiosity, recognition, even a hint of respect that had not been there before. A woman near the entrance shifted her stance, her earlier certainty replaced with a subtle unease, as though she were reconsidering not just Naomi, but her own place in the room. Naomi Carter did not react to any of it. Her hand moved gently along the seam of the gown, her fingers tracing the line where fabric met thread, her touch deliberate, practiced, as if she were reading something written in a language only she fully understood. "This stitch," she said softly, her voice calm and steady, "was done by machine, then corrected by hand to hide tension errors." The statement was not a guess, not an opinion, but an observation delivered with quiet certainty, and it carried a level of detail that could not be dismissed easily. A sales associate took an involuntary step closer, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at the gown, trying to see what Naomi saw, trying to understand what had been invisible just moments ago. Richard followed the gesture, his gaze returning to the fabric, and for the first time, he hesitated, not because he agreed, but because he could no longer be sure that he did not. "Our atelier uses a hybrid process," he said, his tone measured, though now edged with something more careful, more restrained, to ensure consistency. But even as he spoke, the explanation felt less like authority and more like defense, and that shift did not go unnoticed. Naomi lifted her eyes to meet his again, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, but there was a quiet clarity in her gaze that made the room feel as though it had narrowed to just the two of them. "Consistency is not the same as mastery," she replied, her voice even, and the words did not challenge him, they revealed something deeper than technique, something about standards, about understanding, about the difference between creating and presenting. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, filled with unspoken realization, with shifting perspectives, with the subtle recognition that something fundamental had changed. Richard's fingers tightened briefly at his side before relaxing again, a small motion that betrayed more than he intended, the tension he could no longer fully conceal. He looked at Naomi. Truly looked at her this time, not at her clothing, not at the bag she carried, but at the way she stood, the way she spoke, the way she saw things others did not. And in that moment, the question that formed in his mind was no longer whether she belonged, but how he had failed to recognize it sooner. The room remained silent, not out of obligation, but out of awareness, because whatever was unfolding was no longer about a customer being asked to leave, it was about a truth being revealed, slowly, precisely, and in a way that no one present would easily forget. The realization did not arrive all at once, it unfolded slowly, like a thread being pulled loose from a carefully woven fabric, and with each passing second, the room seemed to lose a little more of its certainty, a little more of the structure that had once defined it so clearly. Richard Vaughan remained where he stood, but something about him had shifted, not in position, but in presence, the authority he once carried now tempered by something quieter, something more cautious. His eyes moved again to the gown, then back to Naomi Carter, as if searching for a way to reframe what he had just witnessed, to restore the balance that had been so effortlessly maintained before. But the balance was gone. Naomi's hand rested lightly against the fabric, her fingers no longer tracing, simply still, as though the point had already been made and there was nothing left to prove. The customers, who had once observed from a distance, now stood closer without realizing it, drawn not by spectacle, but by understanding, by the sense that something genuine had entered a space built on appearances. A woman near the center of the room spoke softly, almost to herself. How did she even notice that? And though the question was not directed at anyone, it echoed just enough to reinforce what everyone was beginning to feel. Naomi did not respond. She did not acknowledge the attention. Her focus remained steady, grounded, untouched by the shifting dynamics around her. Richard took a slow breath, his composure returning in fragments, but not in the way it had before. This was no longer about control. It was about recognition, and that was something he had not prepared for. "You said you have made pieces like this," he began, his voice measured, but now carrying a different tone, not dismissive, not defensive, but searching. "For which houses?" The question lingered in the air, not as a challenge, but as a quiet request for clarity, and in the silence that followed, every person in the room seemed to lean in without moving. Naomi lifted her eyes, meeting his gaze once more, and for a moment, there was no tension, no imbalance, just a simple exchange of attention between two people standing on very different understandings of the same world. "The kind that do not display their names on the outside," she said, her voice calm, almost reflective, and though the answer was not specific, it carried a weight that made it more revealing than any brand could have been. A faint murmur passed through the room again, not of doubt, but of recognition, as if the idea itself was enough to shift perception. The sales associate who had been watching stepped closer to the gown, her eyes scanning the seam Naomi had pointed out, her expression slowly changing as she began to see what had once been invisible. Richard noticed this, the way his own staff was now looking at the work differently, the way the room itself had begun to realign around a new understanding, and for the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that this moment was not a disruption, but a correction. Naomi's posture remained unchanged, her presence quiet but undeniable, and in that stillness, there was a kind of authority that did not rely on titles or appearances. The boutique, once defined by its exclusivity, now felt exposed, not in a way that diminished it, but in a way that revealed its limits. And as the silence settled once more, deeper than before, it became clear that whatever had begun as a simple act of dismissal had transformed into something far more significant, a moment where perception had been challenged, and where the truth, once seen, could not be unseen. The question lingered in the air longer than expected, not because it demanded an answer, but because everyone in the room understood that whatever came next would define everything that had already happened, and Naomi Carter seemed to recognize that weight without reacting to it, her expression calm, her posture unchanged, as if she had already accepted the outcome long before anyone else realized there was one. Richard Vaughan watched her closely now, no longer measuring her by appearance, but by something far less visible, something he could not easily categorize or control. The boutique, once filled with quiet confidence, now carried a different kind of energy, something more fragile, more attentive, as though every person present had become aware of how quickly perception could shift. Naomi's gaze moved briefly across the room, not searching, not acknowledging, simply observing, and in that small motion, there was a sense that she saw more than anyone else there, not just the gowns or the displays, but the people, their assumptions, their reactions, their silence. When her eyes returned to Richard, there was no urgency in them, no need to impress or defend, just a quiet readiness to speak when it mattered. "Names are not always the point," she said softly, her voice steady, and though the words were simple, they carried a depth that made them feel intentional, measured. A faint murmur followed, not of disagreement, but of recognition, as if the statement had revealed something many had felt but never articulated. Richard's brow tightened slightly, not in frustration, but in concentration, trying to understand what was being said beneath the surface. "Then what is the point?" he asked, his tone lower now, no longer authoritative, but genuinely searching, and that shift did not go unnoticed. Naomi tilted her head slightly, considering the question, not as a challenge, but as something worth answering. "Who it is made for," she replied, and the room seemed to absorb that sentence differently than anything before it. The customers exchanged brief glances, subtle but meaningful, as if re-evaluating not just Naomi, but themselves, their reasons for being there, their understanding of value. The sales associate near the gown stepped even closer now, her attention fully drawn to the seam Naomi had pointed out. Her fingers hovering just as Naomi's had earlier, hesitant, as if unsure whether she was allowed to see what had now been revealed. Richard followed the movement again, and this time, he did not dismiss it. He studied the fabric more carefully, the line of the stitching, the slight tension that had gone unnoticed before, and though he did not speak it aloud, there was a flicker of realization in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement that something had been overlooked. Naomi remained still, her presence no longer defined by contrast, but by clarity, and in that clarity, the room had begun to shift around her. The guard stood at a distance now, no longer central to the moment, but still watching, his earlier whisper lingering like an unseen force that had set everything in motion. Richard straightened slowly, not to reclaim authority, but to meet the moment differently, to stand within it rather than above it. "If what you are saying is true," he said carefully, his voice measured, "then you understand craftsmanship at a level most people here do not." The statement was not a concession, but it was no longer a dismissal either, and that alone marked a change that could not be undone. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, grounded, certain. "Most people do not need to," she said, and the words settled into the room with quiet finality, not as criticism, but as truth, the kind that does not demand agreement, only recognition, and in that moment, it became clear that whatever had started as a simple act of exclusion had evolved into something far more significant, a quiet confrontation between perception and reality, where only one of them could remain unchanged. The room did not return to normal, it could not, because something fundamental had shifted, something that could not be folded back into polished displays or quiet background music, and Richard Vaughan understood that now in a way that unsettled him more than any direct confrontation ever could. He stood facing Naomi Carter, but no longer as a gatekeeper deciding who belonged, instead as someone trying to understand what he had failed to see from the beginning. The silence that filled the boutique was no longer tense, it was attentive, almost reverent, as though every person present had become aware that they were witnessing something rare, a moment where perception was being quietly dismantled and rebuilt in real time. Naomi did not move to fill that silence. She allowed it to exist, to stretch, to settle, her presence grounded, unaffected by the weight of the attention now centered on her. Richard took a slow breath, his shoulders lowering slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, the kind that comes when certainty gives way to clarity. "You could have said all of this sooner," he said, his voice quieter now, not accusatory, but reflective, and the words carried an undercurrent of something unfamiliar to him, humility. Naomi's expression softened just slightly, not with approval, not with satisfaction, but with understanding. "Would it have made a difference?" she asked, her tone calm, her eyes steady, and the question did not challenge him, it revealed something deeper, something that had been present from the moment she walked in. Richard did not answer immediately. He could not. Because the truth of it settled in slowly, undeniably. It would not have made a difference. Not at the beginning. Not when he had already decided who she was based on what he saw. Around them, the customers shifted again, but this time not out of discomfort, but out of awareness, as though they too were recognizing their own role in what had unfolded. A man near the fitting area lowered his gaze, adjusting his jacket without realizing why, while the sales associate near the gown stepped back slightly, her posture more respectful now, no longer uncertain, but aware. Naomi glanced once more at the gown, her hand dropping gently to her side, her assessment complete, her purpose in the moment fulfilled in a way that required no further explanation. Richard followed her gaze, then looked back at her, and for the first time, there was no barrier in his expression, no calculation, no quiet judgment, only a clear, direct acknowledgement. "I misjudged you," he said, the words simple, but heavy with meaning, and though they were spoken quietly, they carried through the room with more impact than anything he had said before. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady, unshaken, and there was no triumph in her eyes, no need to hold on to the moment longer than necessary. "You judged what you were trained to see," she replied, her voice even, and in that response, there was no accusation, only truth, the kind that does not demand apology, only awareness. The room remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of tension or anticipation, it was the silence of understanding, the kind that settles after something has been revealed and cannot be undone. Richard nodded once, slowly, as if accepting not just her words, but everything they implied, and in that small gesture, the shift was complete. The boutique was no longer the same space it had been minutes before, and neither was he. And as Naomi turned slightly, preparing to step away, not in retreat, but in quiet conclusion, it became clear to everyone watching that what had changed was not just the outcome of a moment, but the way it would be remembered, not as an act of exclusion, but as a lesson that could not be ignored. Naomi Carter did not rush as she turned, her movement unhurried, deliberate, as though the moment behind her had already been resolved long before anyone else understood it, and yet no one in the boutique looked away, not a single person returned to browsing or conversation, because something in the air held them there, a quiet gravity that refused to release its grip. Richard Vaughan remained where he stood, watching her, not with authority, not even with uncertainty anymore, but with a kind of awareness that had only just begun to take shape. The polished marble floor beneath them no longer reflected status, it reflected stillness, a room suspended between what it had been and what it was becoming. Naomi reached the edge of the display, her hand briefly brushing against the strap of her canvas bag as she adjusted it on her shoulder, a simple gesture, almost invisible, yet it carried a quiet finality, as if she had already decided there was nothing more she needed from this space. Behind her, the sales associate who had once hesitated to approach now stepped forward slightly, her voice soft but clear. "Ma'am, would you like to see the rest of the collection?" The question was careful, respectful, and it did not go unnoticed. Naomi paused, just for a moment, her back still turned, her head tilting slightly as though considering something deeper than the offer itself. The room held its breath again, not out of tension, but out of recognition, because this moment was no longer about access, it was about intention. Naomi turned her head just enough to meet the associate's eyes, her expression calm, steady, and thoughtful. "Thank you," she said gently, "but I have already seen what I needed to see." The words settled into the room with quiet precision, not dismissive, not unkind, but complete, and the associate nodded slowly, understanding more than what had been said. Richard stepped forward then, not abruptly, not with the authority he once carried, but with measured intention, as though each step required consideration he had never needed before. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice even, respectful now, and the use of her name did not go unnoticed by anyone listening. Naomi turned slightly, facing him once more, her posture unchanged, her presence as grounded as it had been from the beginning. "If you would allow me," Richard continued, choosing his words carefully, "I would like to make this right." The statement hung in the air, not as a demand, not even as an apology, but as an offering, one that acknowledged the shift without trying to control it. Naomi regarded him quietly, her gaze steady, and for a moment, it seemed as though time itself had slowed within the walls of the boutique. "You already have," she replied, her voice calm, her tone neither forgiving nor condemning, but simply truthful, and in that response, there was no need for further correction, no need for restitution beyond what had already occurred. The room absorbed her words in silence, a silence that no longer felt heavy, but clear, as though something had been realigned. Richard nodded once, slowly, accepting not just her answer, but everything it implied, and in that small gesture, there was a quiet transformation, not dramatic, not visible to the untrained eye, but undeniable. Naomi gave a final glance to the room, not at the people, not at the displays, but at the space itself, as if acknowledging it for what it had revealed, and then she turned fully, walking toward the exit with the same quiet confidence she had carried from the moment she arrived. No one stopped her. No one spoke. And as the door opened and closed behind her, the boutique remained still, not because it had returned to normal, but because everyone inside knew that nothing about it would ever feel the same again. The door had barely settled back into place when the weight of the moment began to settle more deeply into the room, not as tension, but as realization, the kind that lingers long after the event itself has passed, reshaping how everything before it is understood. Richard Vaughan remained standing near the center of the boutique, his gaze fixed on the entrance where Naomi Carter had just disappeared, as if expecting something more, some final confirmation that what had just occurred was real and not a brief disruption in the order he had always trusted. But nothing followed. The street beyond the glass returned to its quiet rhythm, and inside, the boutique stood still, not frozen, but reflective, as though the space itself had begun to reconsider what it represented. A soft movement broke the silence as one of the customers shifted, then another, but no one spoke, not immediately, because words felt insufficient, too small to capture what had just been revealed. The sales associate who had offered Naomi assistance earlier glanced down at the gown she now stood beside, her fingers moving carefully along the seam Naomi had pointed out, and this time, she saw it, not because it had changed, but because her perspective had. Her breath caught slightly, a quiet acknowledgement that what had once seemed flawless was not beyond question. Richard noticed the movement, and slowly, almost instinctively, he stepped closer to the display, his attention now drawn to the same detail he had dismissed before. His hand hovered near the fabric, mirroring Naomi's earlier gesture, but unlike her, he hesitated, not out of uncertainty about touching the garment, but out of recognition that he no longer understood it the way he once believed he did. "Adjust the inspection protocol," he said finally, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a new kind of intention, one that did not seek to reinforce authority, but to correct it. The staff nodded, not out of routine compliance, but with a quiet respect that had shifted along with the room itself. A customer near the fitting area spoke softly, almost to herself. She saw all of that in seconds, and though the comment was not directed at anyone, it resonated, because it captured something no one could deny. Richard turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room, not with control, but with awareness, seeing now what had always been there, the subtle judgments, the quiet assumptions, the invisible lines that had defined who was welcomed and who was not. "We have been looking at the wrong things," he said, more to the space than to any individual, and the statement did not feel like a correction, but like a realization that had been waiting to surface. The security guard remained near the entrance, his posture unchanged, but his presence now understood differently, not as an enforcer, but as a witness to a moment that had quietly reshaped everything. Outside, the light shifted slightly as clouds moved across the sky, casting a softer reflection through the glass, and inside, the boutique no longer felt like a place that separated people, but one that had been confronted with its own limitations. Richard took one last look toward the door, not expecting Naomi to return, but acknowledging that her absence now carried as much meaning as her presence had moments before. And in that stillness, it became clear that what had been revealed was not just about a single interaction, but about the way value had been defined, the way it had been measured, and how easily it could be misunderstood when seen only from the surface. The room did not return to what it had been, because it could not, and in that quiet, lasting shift, something far more important than a single moment of judgment had taken place, something that would remain long after the doors closed. And the lights dimmed. The boutique did not return to its previous rhythm after Naomi Carter left, because there was no previous rhythm to return to anymore, only a new awareness that had quietly settled into every corner of the space, reshaping how each person saw what they had just experienced. Richard Vaughan stood alone near the central display for a moment longer, his eyes no longer scanning for control or confirmation, but reflecting something more internal, something closer to understanding. The gown that had once been the center of attention now felt secondary, as if its value had shifted not in material but in meaning. Around him, the staff began to move again, slowly at first, resuming small tasks that felt different now, less certain, more deliberate. The sales associate who had spoken with Naomi earlier carefully adjusted the fabric on the mannequin, her movements precise, as though she was no longer just arranging a product, but respecting a process she had only just begun to see. Richard finally exhaled, a long, measured breath, and turned toward the counter. "Make a note," he said quietly, his voice steady but no longer commanding in the same way as before. "Every inspection on craftsmanship is to include structural review, not just visual confirmation." There was no resistance in the response, only acknowledgement, because the shift in authority within the room had already occurred without needing to be declared. A few feet away, a customer who had witnessed everything earlier glanced toward the entrance one more time, then back at the displays, as if seeing them differently now, not diminished, but more complex than before. The guard near the door adjusted his stance slightly, no longer part of an intervention that would take place, but part of an understanding that had already concluded. Richard moved slowly along the row of garments, his hand briefly passing near the fabrics without touching them, observing not for judgment, but for comprehension. The environment that had once defined exclusivity now felt more open in a subtle, unexpected way, as though its boundaries had been redrawn by something no one had planned for. He paused near the gown. Naomi had examined, his eyes tracing the same seam she had identified, and this time, he did not need to be told what to see. The flaw was small, almost